Okay, those are the three options. No internal control opinion. We're going to talk about that here in A4. Internal control opinion is required for issuers. For non-issuers, if you want to, you could do a internal control opinion. That's covered under integrated audits that we get to in Chapter 5. Question? Okay, good. So let's go ahead and in A4 here, we're going to start to talk about controlled efficiencies, which the definition of controlled efficiencies is consistent across all the different engagements. So this deficiency discussion really would be the same whether we were talking about the required internal control opinion or the optional control opinions, or where we're not having an internal control opinion, but we're still having to report weaknesses of the internal control to management and those charged with governance, which we cover in this chapter. But let's just take a look at controlled efficiencies first, okay? And controlled efficiencies are what? Not good. Controlled efficiency is not good. It's not a good thing. A controlled efficiency exists when there's a problem with the design or operation of the control does not allow management or their employees in the normal course of business to detect misstatements on a timely basis. So that's obviously not good. Okay, now you could have a bad situation, and then you could have the worst situation. Okay, so the bad situation is called a significant deficiency. The worst situation is called a material weakness. Now you look and you say, well, why did the book talk about the worst before the bad? And the reason is that the definition of significant deficiency really depends on the definition of material weakness. Okay, so significant deficiencies, like material weakness, is little brother. Okay, and so material weakness goes around causing trouble. They say, hey, aren't you material weakness? It says, no, I'm significant deficiency. I'm not as bad as my brother, but you know my brother, you know me. Okay, so what's happening? A material weakness is a deficiency or combination of deficiencies, internal control, such that there is a reasonable possibility. Reasonable possibility means more than 50%. That there will be a material misstatement in the financial statements that will not be prevented or detected on a timely basis. If something, it's more than 50% chance that something will happen, is that the world's way of telling you that something's going to happen? If I tell you that it's more than a 50% chance that something will happen, what does that mean?
It's more than likely than not to happen.
Which means it's going to happen.
Yes.
Right? I mean, eventually it's going to happen, okay, if it's more than 50%. And so what happens? They're telling you, I mean, this is a worse situation. They're telling you that there's going to be a material misstatement in these financial statements, and it's not going to be prevented or detected by the internal control. Well, that's pretty darn horrible situation. You know, no one's going to die as a result. But in terms of, you know, our objective when we're doing audits of financial statements, we want to detect material misstatements. And this thing is telling you, well, we're not going to be able to rely on the internal controls of the entity to do that. So it's now going to fall on the auditor's procedures to do that. And that's something that the standard setters have said, well, that is got to be reported to management and those charged with governance. Auditor, you have responsibility to make sure that you're communicating that to the entity management and the board of directors, those charged with governance. Now, significant deficiency is not as bad as material weakness, but it's important enough that we will also have to report that to management and those charged with governance. Okay, so they're looking at this and they're saying it's not okay, auditor, for you to come in and look at all those horrible internal controls and says, don't look over there, everybody. No, you tell management, those sort of governance, you got to look at that. Okay. And if we get to a point where we are in engagement where we're going to be giving an opinion on the internal control, identifying these are actually going to, no surprise, affect that opinion. And we'll talk more about that in chapter 5. Questions? Okay, good. Now you come over and now we're talking about more what we will need to do once we've identified these material weaknesses, these significant deficiencies. Well, we'll have to evaluate weaknesses in the internal control, and we'll have to decide what bucket they fall into. Are they just the not good control deficiency? Reporting those is a little less ominous than what our requirement to report those is less burdensome, if you will, if I should use that word for the auditor, or less prescriptive as to what we're supposed to do with those. Okay, we identify the not good control deficiency, but if we identify what material weaknesses and significant deficiencies, we've already been told we must report those to management and those charged with governance. Now, when we are trying to decide if a weakness is just an ordinary, not good control deficiency, or the worst thing, a material weakness, or the bad significant deficiency, we need to look at the magnitude of the potential misstatement and the reasonable possibility that there'll be. So it's the likelihood and what? The magnitude. It's likelihood and magnitude that we're concerned about when we look to determine if something, the likeliness of the misstatement and the size of the misstatement will help us determine if something's a material weakness or a significant deficiency. Okay, so you can see those words down here, which I like better, the likelihood and the magnitude of misstatement, and the auditor considers both of those in determining if a weakness is indeed a material weakness or a significant deficiency. Okay. All right, good. So now we're going to talk about communication here now. And now, okay, good. We're on page 80. Okay, at the top of page 80. Okay. And at this point, we are talking about now the communication requirements for a non-public company where we are simply not required to give the opinion. So this is the non-public company, no IC opinion is involved. That's that first possibility that we talked about back a few pages back, right? Remember when we sat here and we looked at the 3 different possibilities right here? Okay, for the rest of this discussion, we're talking about that situation. We'll get into these situations, as I mentioned earlier, when we get to our A5 discussion in a little while. Okay. All right. Is there a question? No question? Okay. Okay, good. Looks like everybody's muted. So make sure you're muted, guys, so that I don't have that ambient noise. Okay, good. All right, so let's just go ahead then and let's take a look now and see what happens when we're just doing an audit. We've done an audit under SAS, and we are not going to be giving an internal control opinion. Okay, what do they tell us? Even though you're not giving an internal control opinion, significant deficiencies and material weaknesses need to be reported to management and those charged with governance. Okay, if there have been previously communicated material weaknesses and they haven't been, and significant deficiencies, and they haven't been corrected, report them again. That's somewhat new. It used to be that you only had to report them once, and once you reported them once, you didn't have to keep repeating it. Now they tell you, hey, if you've already reported the significant deficiency, the material weakness, and they still haven't corrected it, say in the next year, then you're going to have to report it again. Okay. Now they give us a window of time from the completion of the audit as to when we will report this weakness. And so they give us 60 days from the date that we had completed the audit to when we would communicate the significant deficiencies and material weaknesses. Okay. Now notice what they're telling us here then, that there's really no requirement telling us specifically when or having to report at all the not good control deficiencies. So they only call out what? Material weaknesses and significant deficiencies that have to be reported, and then they start telling us when. They give us what? 60 days. Okay. Now, management evaluation, and management may decide to accept certain significant deficiencies and material weaknesses. Even in such situations, we are still required to report those. So we may know that management has gone ahead and said, hey, the cost of correcting that is not worth the benefit of correcting that. Doesn't matter. We're going to be that, nagging person that keeps telling you, hey, I've accepted that I don't eat healthy. Stop telling me to eat healthy, right? It's one of those kinds of things. Well, they're still going to tell you, right? And they're going to keep repeating that. Hopefully someday they'll hear it and do something about it. Okay. Now, when we communicate this, we communicate it, and it could be in writing or orally. Okay. Even if it is orally, we still should document that we made this communication, since it is required that you communicate those to management and those charged with governance. I can't really see a reason why you wouldn't follow a template to report this to management and those charged with governance in writing. If you do not, then you're going to have to write up what you said to them orally, maybe what their responses were, and then document that appropriately in the work papers. Okay. Now, if you've decided to report, to communicate, okay, the not good control deficiencies. So when they say other deficiencies, they mean those that are not material weaknesses, those that are not significant deficiencies. You just decided to report the not good control deficiencies to them, and management has chosen not to correct the deficiencies. The auditor need not repeat those. Okay, so you don't have to communicate the not good control deficiencies. And if they still choose not to correct them, then those they're saying you don't have to repeat. Okay, now let's look at the communication requirements. Okay, let's just stop and take a look at that. The written communication of significant deficiencies and material weaknesses should include. Now, you don't have to do a written communication. Again, we're still talking about the situation where we're auditing a non-public company and we're not giving the optional internal control opinion, but we're having to communicate material weaknesses, significant deficiencies, and we have decided to do that in writing. So we will have to give them the definition of material weakness and significant deficiency, and you've already seen that. I showed you the definitions, and that we said, hey, material weakness, more than likely there's going to be a material misstatement. Significant deficiencies, not as bad as material weakness, but we're still supposed to report it to you. So we would actually provide those definitions in the written communication, a description of the significant deficiencies, the material weakness, and you do not have to quantify the effects, and you don't have to actually have found an error. You could just talk about potential effects. I used to do this quite a bit when I was working with the GAO. It was great if you could find a misstatement, but if you couldn't necessarily find a misstatement or find the actual effect of a problem, because it wasn't always a financial statement audit, you would describe to them, well, this is the potential effect of this particular problem with your internal control. So it doesn't have to actually have been the misstatement. You could just describe the potential misstatement or the potential effect. Okay. And then you come over and you let them know that the purpose of the audit was to express an opinion on the financial statements, not to express an opinion on the internal control, and you're not doing such. So you're literally disclaiming an opinion on the internal control here, okay? And then this report is restricted it's it's not even really a report, it's a communication, a written communication between you and the management and those charged with governance. It is not published. It's not published along with the financial statements with your opinion. It is a restricted document. Okay. All right, good. Flashcard those key points. And then let's go ahead and create another flashcard down here about things that you could include in the communication if you want to. You don't have to. So they say that the auditor may also, those things up there that I flashcard, you have to communicate, but you may also want to go ahead and provide some other things, which is a description of the inherent limitations of the internal control. You may also want to indicate that the auditor may not report the absence of significant deficiencies because there is too great a potential for misinterpretation of the very limited degree of assurance the auditor will be providing in such instances. And the auditor may issue a communication indicating that no material weaknesses were identified during the audit. So you don't tell them, hey, you don't have any material weaknesses. Hey, you don't have any significant deficiencies, because that's not really the scope of your audit. You could simply tell them that you did not identify them. That doesn't mean that they don't have a significant deficiency or material weakness. You could include that information if you want to. Now, this part is a little annoying, but I have seen questions where the examiners like to ask about this, and I find it annoying because the examiners ask questions about it, yet this is something that to me would be highly improbable of happening, which is management takes your restricted communication that's just between you and management and somehow decides that they want to publish that. They want to argue with you publicly and say, well, the cost of correcting these weaknesses would outweigh the benefit of correcting them. And they go ahead and they publish. Now, they have something that could have been left in their bottom drawer. They take it out of the bottom drawer and they publish it somewhere where people can see it. That's calling out weaknesses in their internal control. So it's kind of like you're having an argument with your significant other, and it's just between you and them inside the house, and then you go out on the front lawn and start having that same argument. Well, why did you do that? And it was inside your house, now it's outside your house. But if they choose to bring that to the attention outside of the entity and they start making comments like, well, the cost would outweigh the benefit, then the auditor needs to disclaim an opinion on that commentary of management and say, hey, we are not down with that point that they make. We disclaim an opinion on that comment. Again, I find it highly unlikely that that would be the case. It's probably something that is articulated in the standard, and then some maniac that was writing a CPA exam question decided that that would be a good thing to write a CPA exam question about, because the chances that something like that would happen are highly unlikely. But I'm going to have to ask you to flashcard that, because I have seen a couple questions that hit on that highly unlikely scenario. Okay. Now, in such responses, well, that's what they're saying. That's part of that whole thing right there, that description, that situation I described, that they publish it along with your letter to them about the problems, then you would need to disclaim an opinion on that commentary. Okay, question? Okay, I think that would be stupid if they did that, but if management did that, that's what you'd have to do. Okay, they give us examples, guys. I had you flashcard the key elements that go into the written communication. You don't need to pour over that. So let's go ahead and take a look at a couple multiple choice questions here, and then we'll be able to wrap up chapter 5. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and take a look at this one. Looks like just about everybody's had a chance to take a shot at it. Okay, we did pretty good here. Part of the reason that you may not have felt as comfortable with this question is that this is really something we talked about at the end of class last time. It's testing, our understanding of stuff that we talked about on Wednesday last week. But the answer here is B, and most of us got it right. Now, a couple things about this question. One, they put this thing in here, assume those charged with governance are not involved in managing the entity. And I find that annoying because that gives you absolutely no help in answering this question at all. It is not necessary set of information for you to be able to answer this question. And so they really just put that there to kind of confuse you and get you to start thinking about these differently, as though it would have been a different answer if those involved in the entity were part of those charged with governance. It wouldn't change anything here, okay? In terms of that piece of information doesn't help you to answer this question, okay, is what I'm trying to say, okay? So what happens? Remember we said last time, the second thing, we said everything goes up, not everything goes down. So everything that's communicated goes up to the board of directors, those charged with governance. Not everything you say to those charged with governance goes down to management, okay? So that takes A out right now. Okay, let's just get rid of that right now. Any matters communicated to those charged with governance also require to be reported to the entity's management. No, you may be telling, those charged with governance, the management really needs to have better training, or you may want to consider giving them some more information, or maybe the staffing levels are something that need to be considered, and you don't necessarily want to share that right out with management, though you may tell those charged with governance that, okay? C, disagreements with management about the application of accounting principles are not required to be communicated to those charged with governance if they have been appropriately resolved. That's not true. We said that we want the board of directors to know the disagreements, the various problems we may be had in completing the audit. So they may look at an unmodified opinion if we don't inform them and think that everything's running smoothly. Meanwhile, there was some turbulence in getting to that good outcome. We want those charged with governance to know about that so they can help to maybe correct things and make our effort a little easier going forward. D, significant efficiency internal control previously reported to those charged with governance need not be that have not been corrected need not be communicated again. No, we just said that. Hey, if they don't correct something, you repeat that, right? The whole analogy about telling somebody to, exercise and have a better diet, even if they don't do it, you keep telling them that, right? Okay. And so the correct answer is B. The auditor is required to inform those charged with governance about significant errors discovered by the auditor and subsequently corrected by management. Now, look, if they are part, those charged with governance are the management, then yeah, you wouldn't have to tell them again as they switch their hat from those charged with governance to management. But that phrase, that sentence, assume those charged with governance are not involved in the managing the entity, B would still be the right answer, whether that's there or not. Okay, so I think they put that there more to distract you than to help you. Question? Okay, good. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at the next one. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and take your selections, wrap this one up. Okay, and let's see what we've got here. Okay, we're hovering around 70% for the correct answers here, and I hope that you are making the flashcards that I'm asking you to, particularly, well, in general, you should just be making them. But the reason I ask for certain flashcards for some of the um, topics here is that it simply becomes, you just got to remember what it is that you need to report in some of these reports. So I'm not asking you to memorize it's not a report, but the communication here. I'm not asking you to communicate that. I mean, I'm not asking you to memorize the whole structure of the communication, but I am asking you to memorize some of the key elements of what were included in there, because it comes down to a question like this: what needs to be included in an auditor's letter issued on significant deficiencies related to non-issuers internal control observed during the audit should, and it was right off the flashcard, indicate that the purpose of the audit was to audit the financial statements, not to provide an opinion on internal control. That would just come right off the flashcard. You don't make that flashcard, you probably missed that question on the exam. Okay, so you need to make those cards, and when it comes to stuff like this, for sure. You should make them anyway, but definitely in these cases. Okay, all right, don't worry about the rest of the old chapter 4. I think I don't think it was Armor or somebody reported, indicated to us last time that this has been removed. Communication with component auditors is now no longer tested. If you are going to take your exam the next week or so during June, then you may want to spend a couple of minutes looking at these couple pages, but I'm not going to spend our time together on that now. Question? Okay, good. So let's go ahead then and get out of this. I guess they're not going to let me close it for some reason, but that's okay. I'll just flip over to the next one. I don't see the little X there. Usually there's an X there, but okay, that's fine. Okay. All right, good. So let's go ahead then and let's take a look at chapter 5. And what we're going to do in chapter 5 now is really continue the discussion of internal control communication, but now we're going to talk about it in the context of integrated audit procedures. So that's the non-public company option to provide the internal control opinion versus the public company. Now we are required to give an opinion on the internal control. So we're really going to continue that. And that's really all of this part right here. You can count on 5 points of material there. They're definitely going to ask you about that. Okay. At test engagements is going to be, you can make this 10 points. They're going to ask you about that. So let's make that 10 points. Okay. At test engagements is about 5 points. Okay. Actually, the way they ask it there, sorry guys, is about 2 points, because then they start getting into a variety of test engagements. And so they'll start talking about prospective financial statements and agreed upon procedures. Each of those are 5 points. Okay. Now I'm going to give you a heads up. I'm going to be putting the 4.0 version of chapter 5 up here pretty quickly, because when we get on some of these other areas, reports on service organizations, that was something that was changed for the July version of the exam. So I'll be putting up a different chapter, a different PDF for that. Reporting on compliance is fairly light. Okay, so they do start to dump a bunch of other areas in this chapter. Is 2 points. Government audits, single audits, about 2 points. And where we're going to pick up some time for this discussion here is I actually have a shorter outline that I put together for this, since government audit standards are listed by the agency I used to work for, the GAO. I think it's okay if I go ahead and I kind of gave you a 3-page version of this, because I felt like Becker goes on, and I think just between you and I had the feeling that at some point somebody got lost and just started writing everything that's in the standards and throwing it into this thing, as though we have the luxury to sit here and slog through, you know, from page 61 to 83, trying to pull out the nuggets. So I finally just went ahead and I wrote my own outline. So we'll go through some of the stuff that's there, but then I'm going to give you my own outline. And it's only 2 points. I'm not going to sit here and waste your time with 22 pages of information for 2 points. I'm not doing that. Okay, question? Okay, so the first part of this, we're going to use the 3.5 version, and then we're going to switch over to 4.0 next time. Don't worry about that now. Okay, all right, good. Let's go ahead then. And again, we're talking about integrated audit procedures. When we talk about integrated now, we're talking about integrating the audit of the financial statement with an opinion on internal control. Okay, so when we talk about this, you're going to see that there are times where we will talk about issuers or non-issuers separately, because there are annoying tiny differences between the two. And so the approach that Becker took is, rather than say, well, for issuers do this, but in this area, non-issuers do that, from time to time, they just separate the discussion. So I'm going to point out to you when we're only talking about issuers and non-issuers, but you're going to see that the differences are almost like eye rolling, like, okay, you know, who cares? Why can't they just decide to do the same thing? What happened was that PCAOB wrote their requirements for how you give an opinion on the internal control of a public company, which is required first. And then the AICPA did the best they could to make the requirements in an optional opinion engagement on the internal control as close to the PCAOB requirements as possible, but there were needs, I guess, for some small differences. And so you see that we'll talk about them separately in many cases, in a few cases. Okay, now we start out though, when we talk about the objective of the engagement, and it's the same for both. The objective of the engagement is to give an opinion on the effectiveness of the internal control. The only difference is what? It is required for what? For public companies under PCAOB standards. For non-issuers, okay, same objective, but now giving that opinion is what? Is optional. Okay, so for the most part, we'll talk about them simultaneously together. Okay, I'm trying to underscore issuers and non-issuers here. In terms of the objective of the engagement, it's the same. Okay, we want to give the opinion on the internal control. So the objective is the same. The difference is it's required for our public companies. For non-public companies, giving that opinion is optional. But once you accept that engagement, that's the objective, is to give an opinion on the internal control over financial reporting. Okay. All right, good. So let's just go ahead and let's take a look at the conditions and or what the audit requirements are first for issuers and non-issuers, the same. Okay, the auditor's internal control should be integrated with the audit of the financial statements. So you have to audit the financial statements. You must have audited the financial statements in order to give the opinion on the internal control. Okay. You have to use the same criteria to evaluate the internal control that management did. Most entities will use the committee sponsoring organizations of the Treadway Commission, the COSO requirements that we studied you way back in whatever it was, I think chapter 2. Those are the criteria that are generally used: the control environment, the risk assessment, the control procedures, the communication, information communication, and then the monitoring. That's usually what you use to evaluate the internal control. Bottom line, auditors need to use the same criteria that management would use in assessing their own internal control. Test of controls. Yes. You must test the controls when you are going to give the opinion on the internal control. Do you have to test the controls when you are simply giving a regular SaaS audit with no opinion on the internal control? Do you have to test them?
Depends on where RMM is.
Okay, so that would be no then, right?
Yeah, no.
Have to. Yeah, if you assess the risk management statement at less than the maximum, which I think is what you're saying, Matt, you have to test them. If you assess the risk management statement at more than the maximum, you don't have to test them, right? But now we're saying if you're going to give an opinion on the internal control, now you have to test the controls. Those tested controls will be the evidence to support whatever your opinion is on that control. Okay. Okay, good, good, good. All right. Now flashcard those requirements. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to start to talk separately about the requirements for issuers versus non-issuers. So we've got an area here where we're going to have some differences. Now let me explain. Sarbanes-Oxley, why we have this difference right here. Sarbanes-Oxley, section 404. By the way, there's lots of sections to Sarbanes. There's sections that talk about criminal penalties and section 200s and different responsibilities of board of directors and et cetera, right? But section 404 of Sarbanes is the part that as CPAs become probably most familiar with because it is requiring that for a public company, when they issue their annual report, the annual report contained the financial statements. The annual report contained the financial statements. The annual report contained the auditor's opinion on the financial statements, and there will be management's own assessment of their internal controls. So what Sarbanes did is said, management, get off your ass and go and assess your own internal controls and issue your own attestation as to the effectiveness of the internal control. Auditor, you will look to see the job that management did in assessing their internal control and issue your own opinion on their assertions about their internal control. So Sarbanes did that. And if you think about it, Sarbanes, section 404, created a reporting bubble, didn't they? Annual report, right? Financial statements, opinions on financial statements, management's assessment of their own internal control, assertions about the effectiveness of their own internal control, auditor opinion on management's assessment of their internal control. Okay. Now, what happens? Non-public companies don't have a reporting bubble. They don't have to issue annual report. They're not listed, so there's no requirement that they have to give an annual report. So what the AICPA did is, if a company decides to get the opinion on internal control, we're going to make you include that in a reporting bubble that is similar to what public companies do. That's the only reason we have this difference here. Okay, but you're going to see that at the end of the day, it's like, really? So they're almost the same thing. Okay, so let's just go ahead and let's take a look though. First, for the public companies, Sarbanes-Oxley, and there has to be an internal control report, okay, that is included in the annual report. And in that, management states their responsibility for the internal control and contains an assessment at the end of the most recent fiscal year of the effectiveness of the internal control and procedures or for issuers for financial reporting. Okay, so they have to do that. So it has to be in their annual report. Okay, now what happens? So then the AICPA comes in and they say, okay, since we can't tell a public company to have an annual report, okay, what's going to happen is the auditor will accept responsibility, have to have management accept responsibility for the effectiveness of the internal control and evaluate the effectiveness of the internal control using a suitable criteria. And here the AICPA puts in a commercial for their own criteria for assessing internal control. But these days, just about everybody uses Sarbanes, okay? And then support its assessment about the effectiveness of internal control. And then they tell us that what? They will need to provide a written assessment about the effectiveness of internal control as of date, which is going to be the date of the financial statements, And if management refuses to furnish a written assessment, the auditor should withdraw from the engagement. Okay, so they're telling us what, just like under Sarbanes, non-public companies are going to have to write up the effectiveness of their own internal control. And if they don't do these things, the auditor will do what? The auditor will withdraw from the engagement. So they've set up a reporting mechanism that is very similar to what Sarbanes did by saying, auditor, you can't accept the engagement unless they give you that written assessment. Okay. Question? Okay, good. So they have to provide a written assessment. That written assessment has to go along with the auditor's opinion on the internal control. Now, we will need to get written representations, and both issuers and non-issuers have to get these written representations. Remember, last time we talked about the representation letter, management representation letter, and we said that management provides information about obligatory things like, yes, they're responsible for the financial statements. Yes, they're responsible for the internal control. They gave us complete information. And then there was a series of things I said were hard to audit. They tell us about their programs to prevent fraud. They talk to us about subsequent events, right? Well, if we're now also either going to be required for a non-public company or optionally have been engaged to give an opinion on the internal control for a non-public company, then we're going to have to extend the representations that we talked about last time, which really were primarily relevant to the financial statement part of the audit, and extend those representations now to the internal control part of the audit. So let's just go ahead and flashcard those written representations that we have to receive from management. Okay, so management has to acknowledge its responsibility for maintaining the internal control. Okay, it will state management's assessment as a specified date and the criteria they use, the COSA, whatever, and that date is typically the date of the financial statements. Okay, affirm that they didn't rely on the auditor's procedures. So we don't want management sitting there, hey, auditor, hurry up and finish your work with internal control. Because whatever you say, that's what I say. No, they must have done work to support an assessment on their own. Okay. If there are deficiencies, they have communicated those to us. If there's been any fraud, they've told us about that and how it relates to the internal controls, and state whether there have been any significant changes to internal control after the as of date of the report. So look, year end is 12/31, and then we're in there and we're doing our audit work in January, February. It could go extend all the way to maybe March, let's say, right? And so what happens? They don't have to sit there and not do anything about the weaknesses. They could make some corrections to weaknesses that they've identified while we're finishing up the audit. And so they could go ahead and if there were significant changes, the as of date and corrective actions, they can tell us about that in the written communication, the written representation that they give to the auditor. This is from management to the auditor. Failure to obtain such written communication, big deal, just like we said for the management representation letter and this financial statement audit, results in disclaimer or withdrawal, probably withdrawal. Okay. Now, they start to get into some amount of detail, guys, here is how to plan the audit of the internal control. I find it a little too much. It starts to get into that situation where Becker starts taking a standard that comes out and they start dumping the entire standard into the outline. I'm going to ask you to flashcard some things that I have seen tested in some of the questions rather than sit here and give you this on and on about everything you have to do to plan, conduct the engagement. Okay, so let's just start to take a look here at this top-down approach. Okay, and they could ask you a couple questions about this. Okay, and there are entity level controls such as the control environment, the potential for management override of those controls. That's sort of the entity level controls that you would look at. And then there are what? There are assertion level controls. Okay, so this is going to be what? Dealing with the account size, the risk of material misstatement associated with those, etc. So you're going to look at both for the top-down approach, entity level, and assertion level type controls. Okay, just flashcard the nature of those that are entity-wide, entity level versus assertion level. Okay, good. Now you come down, and just a reminder, we have to we have to test the controls. Okay, you got to test the controls. That is a requirement that we only have when we are going to be giving the opinion on the internal controls. So evaluate the design, do some walkthroughs, and then do what? Test the operating effectiveness. Okay, so very similar to what you would do anyway if you were going to be giving an opinion on the financial statements and you decided you needed to test the controls. But now they're telling us, hey, even if you had determined that you didn't want to test the controls for the financial statement audit purpose, you would need to test the controls to support your opinion on internal controls. So that's a difference, that we have to test the controls when we're giving an opinion. Okay, they talk a little bit about benchmarking down here, and all we're saying here is if the entity has automated controls and those automated controls have not changed since you last tested them, you do not have to test them again. That is called benchmarking, and they don't require us to retest automated controls if they haven't changed, because computers don't break up with their girlfriends and lose their minds, right? Computers, if they were working last time, they're going to work this time. Okay, so you don't need to retest automated controls. Okay, now what happens? Evaluating control deficiencies, and let's just take a look at how that works. And again, when we look at control deficiencies, they may be what? Material weaknesses, they may be significant deficiencies. Now, control weakness may be material even if no misstatement actually occurred, okay? Also, there could be what? There could be compensating controls. If the tested control was found to be ineffective, you could find a control that steps in and compensates for the control that maybe could have a potential to create a material misstatement. Okay. Okay, good. Then you go ahead and again, what are we here for? We're going to form the opinion on the internal controls. So after forming the opinion on the internal control, then you're going to look at management's report, and you're going to grade management's report, because remember, management also is required under Sarbanes, and then the AICPA requirements mirrored that. They are required to look at their own internal control. Remember, I said get off your ass and look at your own internal controls and write up an assessment. And then the auditor looks at what management wrote up in their assessment and basically grades their paper. Okay, so let's just go ahead and see what their assessment should include, and let's flashcard this. So they have to indicate that they're responsible, describe that they're talking about the internal controls, criteria that they use, probably going to use COSO, give the as of date, which is the financial statement date, describe any material weaknesses that they've identified. Okay, now if management determines that the required disclosures of material weakness have not been included in their management's report, the auditor needs to bring it up in their report. Okay, if management's report doesn't do a good job of describing the weakness, then the auditor will include it in their report. And if management refuses to supply a report to the auditor, then again, the auditor will withdraw. I think we'd already had said that earlier. Okay, if management reports contains additional information, for example, the cost of correcting the weaknesses will outweigh the benefit, the auditor will disclaim an opinion. Now here, this may be more likely than what we were saying before, just a straight SAS audit where we're not giving an opinion on the internal control, because now the whole objective of the audit was for us to provide an opinion on internal control, and we're not, showing it to each other saying, looky, the opinion on internal control. The whole point is that that's going to be published in a document with the financial statements, the annual report, and all that. So now, if management decided to start, the cost of correcting these deficiencies will outweigh the benefit, and they say that, we can't stop them from saying that because that's their opinion, but we will disclaim an opinion on their commentary, and that could happen. Okay, that's much more likely happening than the other situation. Okay, good. I'm trying to highlight that last part, not underline that. Okay, question, guys?
I had a quick question. When they mentioned on page 4, there was like a note that said like for AICPA they use like the term management's assessment, and then for PCAOB they use management's assertion. Is that relevant or important or not really? There was like a right under the Sarbanes-Oxley 404 on page 4.
Yeah. No, I know what you're talking about. As long as they, we can look, I'm almost there, I guess. As long as you understand that it's the same thing, that one is calling it an assertion, the other is calling it an assessment, then no, it's not a big deal. There's not going to be a question that's going to say, under Sarbanes, they call management's written information about the internal control and assessment, and under
right.
SBA, they call it assertions. They're not going to say that. They won't ask you questions as long as you understand it's the same thing.
Okay, that is the same thing. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean their assessment essentially is an assertion. They make an assessment, and in that assessment, they're asserting to you that the controls do their job, or we have these certain material weaknesses, whatever, right?
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, and then the auditor gives an opinion. The opinion technically is on the management's assessment / assertion. I mean, that's really what the opinion's on, even though they call it an opinion on internal control. But management had already given an assessment, and you're in effect giving an opinion on their assessment. That's why you correct it and see what their report should have, which is what we were talking about there. Okay, all right, good. Now come over and let's just quickly take a look at this question. And I'm going to have a little summary chart of a lot of this stuff for you. I've asked you to flashcard several things, but I'm also going to give you a summary chart of some of the key things here after we look at a little bit more information. Okay, but let's go ahead and take a look at this question. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and take a look at this one. And okay, we didn't do too well here. So let's just take a look and see what we can pick up from this. Okay, so um, in an audit of an issuer, the auditor must provide an opinion. That's true, right? Issuer must provide an opinion, right? That's required. Okay. On which of the following? The financial statements?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm not seeing how anyone that's got this far in this class, well, I guess one, never mind. Right? I mean, okay, they didn't even give us that one. We know you gotta give an opinion on the financial statements. Otherwise, what have we been doing for the last several weeks, right? Okay, good. Do we have to give an opinion on the audit committee's oversight on financial reporting and internal control? Show me somewhere where we said anything about giving an opinion on the audit committee's anything. No. So if you picked one that included two, you were getting pretty creative. I don't see anywhere where we said that. Did we say that you have to give an opinion on the internal control?
Yes.
Yeah, we just spent several, over an hour here sort of talking about that, right? Okay, so the answer, what is A here? Okay, which most of you got it right. Okay. Okay, but you can see why I'm sitting here and I'm saying, hey, flashcard this stuff, because after you're sitting there and you're working your exam and you've just, worked, 40 multiple choice questions, this may not seem as easy as it maybe seemed to some of you now, although only 40% of us got it right. So anyway, make the flashcards, but kind of start to get a feel for some of the basic things we're saying here too. All right. Okay, good. Yeah, okay, let's go ahead. I think we might as well take a break right now. And we'll come back at, let's just make it straight up 6:30, and we'll pick up with module 2 here, okay? I'm going to pause the recording. Somebody remind me to start it up again. Resume the recording. And we're going to talk a little bit about the internal control opinion and the structure of that here in a couple of minutes. But before we do that, we're going to talk about the requirements for communication between the CPA and management and those charged with governance. And we're going to see there's a fair amount of similarity between what we've already talked about in the regular financial statement audit, where we're not even giving an opinion on internal control. We had the requirement, right, to communicate significant deficiencies and material weaknesses to management and those charged with governance. So we're going to talk about the nature of that communication in an engagement now where we were required or had decided to give an opinion on the internal control. They still talk to us about what we have to communicate to management and those charged with governance. So it's a little annoying because, well, we are issuing an external report that's going to call out weaknesses. So why are they telling us different things that we have to communicate to management and those charged with governance? Well, there are some different things they want us to report, and they're telling us what those are in this section. Then we'll look at the structure of the opinion on internal control after that. Okay, so let's take a look, and they tell us that the auditor, okay, and this is for our integrated audits again, where we're giving the opinion on the internal control and auditing the financial statements, but they're telling us when you communicate to management and those charged with governance, you have to communicate in writing significant deficiencies and material weaknesses that were found during the audit of the internal controls. And that's the case that they're telling us here for non-issuers, what the specific requirements are. Now, the only reason they have decided to talk about non-issuers separately here, guys, is there's a tiny, tiny little bit of difference in terms of timing on reporting these things that caused Becker to sit there and talk about these differences, talk about the two issuers and non-issuers in two separate sections of the book here. But the difference is pretty minute. It's really a timing difference, okay? Now, if there were some that were previously communicated but have not been corrected, we have to do what? We have to report them again. So flashcard that, but you can see a similarity here. They tell us, hey, for the worst material weaknesses, the bad significant deficiencies, you have to report that to management and those charged with governance, and you have to repeat what you have previously reported. So that's exactly what we said before, where we weren't even required to give the opinion on internal control. You had this responsibility to report these to management and those charged with governance. Now, small but important timing difference here, okay? Remember that they told us when we are just doing the audit of the financial statements and not giving the opinion on internal control, but we still have to report significant deficiencies and material weaknesses to management and those charged with governance. They gave us 60 days from the report release date. Here they're telling us you have to report these things by your report release date. So they don't give us that 60-day window here for time to report the significant deficiencies and the material weaknesses. Okay. Now, it's not a Christmas present, so it is okay to report these earlier. Okay. You don't have to wait till the engagement is over to report these. It's not like I've got some weaknesses for you, but I can't tell you yet. As you identify those, you can report them, because that would allow them then to potentially start to take a look at those and maybe make some corrections on them as soon as possible. Okay. Now, when we were talking about the situation where we're not giving an opinion at all on the internal control for a non-public company, we didn't say much about the not good control weaknesses. So now they're telling us, hey, all deficiencies. And when they say all deficiencies, what they're really trying to say to us here is the not good control deficiencies. Those control deficiencies that have not risen to the level of material weakness, have not risen to the level of a significant deficiency. Okay, all weaknesses need to be communicated, but the written communication can be made 60 days after the report release date. Okay, and you have to communicate those to management. So what they're saying to us is, we'll give you a little bit more time from the report release date and to give you time to gather the information and report about control deficiencies, those that are not material weaknesses, those that are not significant deficiencies. If there's significant deficiencies, material weaknesses, you need to get them by the report release date to not only management, but those charged with governance. Okay. Now, you are not required to search for control deficiencies that are less severe than material weaknesses, but those that are identified should be reported, and they need to be reported to who? They need to be reported to management. So they're starting to say, hey, you don't necessarily have to bother those charged with governance about those control deficiencies that are not significant deficiencies, are not material weaknesses. Okay. Okay, good. Now you come over, and if the auditor concludes, let's just come back up, okay, that the oversight of the board of directors is not good, you have to tell them that. Is this a conversation you want to have with the board of directors? That's a question.
Yes.
Well, you have to have it with them. Do you want to have it with them? Who hires and fires the auditors?
Audit committee hires and fires.
So do you want to tell your boss that they're not doing a good job?
Not really.
That's kind of a hard one to slip across to them, right? But the standards are saying if they're not doing a good job, hey, you got to communicate that. Okay. Okay, good. And then sort of a point that we had made before, you can't provide assurance that all deficiencies were less severe than a material weakness, or that all material weaknesses have been identified, and you can't issue any report stating that no deficiencies were noted, and the auditor should also not issue reports stating that no material weaknesses were identified. So giving us some limitations on what we're able to report. Go ahead and flashcard that. And again, they don't want us to get out too far saying, oh yeah, you have no weaknesses, when really, we didn't do sufficient work to be able to do that. Okay. Okay, good. Now, when we get into the issuers, there's some kind of annoying differences here. So we were just talking about the communication and management of those charged with governance for a non-public company when you have also given an opinion on the internal control, right? In the last chapter, towards the end, we talked about, well, what are those responsibilities when you haven't given an opinion on the internal control with a non-public company? Now, what are the communications management and those charged with governance when you're auditing a public company, okay? So the auditor must communicate in writing to management and audit committee all material weaknesses identified during the audit. What's missing? They told us about material weaknesses, right? What's missing? What have we said?
All other deficiencies?
The significant deficiencies.
Good, very good, guys. They are silent as to significant deficiencies. They don't say anything. They say what? You must communicate in writing all what? Material weaknesses. And now they say that the written communication, no 60-day window, no by the report release date, they say you need to get those to management and those charged with governance prior to the issuance of your report on the financial statements. Okay, so little tiny difference in what has to be reported and difference in what timing, thus the reason that we separated out issuers from non-issuers. Okay, now we say that the auditor should communicate in writing all deficiencies. So now they're saying what? The significant deficiencies and the weaknesses that don't rise to a level of material weakness or significant deficiencies, right? Those have to be informed, the audit have to be reported to management, and you have to inform the audit committee that such communication has been made. So now they have kind of treated significant deficiencies in a manner similarly to how for non-public companies we treat just the not good control deficiencies. So they really lump significant deficiencies and material weaknesses in, significant deficiencies and not good control deficiencies together in the same group of reporting. And they're saying, hey, those really only need to go to management, but because there's significant deficiencies mixed in there, you better let those charged with governance know that you've made the communication. So if they want to, they can go and ask management what was the nature of those communications. Question on that? So it gets a little bit weird, right? Okay. Now you start to come in here, and now we start to have deja vu. If we conclude that the oversight by the audit committee is not good, we have to tell them that. That's a tough conversation to have with your boss, right? An auditor does not provide assurance that all control deficiencies or all significant deficiencies have been identified. So the auditor does not issue a report noting that. And that was similar to what we saw for the non-public companies, but flashcard that. Okay, so the only reason we separated off those communications, guys, was because what? Because they gave a little more time for the non-public companies by the report release date versus prior to the report release date for the public companies. And they took the significant deficiencies and did what? Stuck them down with the not good control deficiencies in terms of how those are reported to just management and not necessarily the board of directors. Other than that, the non-public company and public company communication, when you're issuing an opinion on the internal control, were the same. Okay. Okay, good. Now let's get back to the opinion, to the report. So this is not now just communication between the auditor and management and those charged with governance. Now we're talking about the report. Okay. And there's really, I'm not even sure why they separate the non-issuers from the issuers here. Okay. Because they tell us in both cases, but let's just look at it for the non-issuers here, that the auditor is required to report. Oh, I know why they note a difference, but it's stupid. The reason Becker separates it here, which is kind of stupid, is that when we issue a combined report, where we're issuing a report both on the financial statements and the opinion on internal control, the opinion on internal control is in an emphasis of matter paragraph for non-public companies, but for public companies, we call that paragraph what? An explanatory paragraph. And that's the only reason they separated these. It's almost so stupid I forgot it. Okay. Okay, so what happens? The auditor is required to report both on the company's financial statements and on the internal control, and it could be done in two separate reports or one combined report. Now, if it is two separate reports, then the reports must refer to each other. So the report on internal control will point to the report on the opinion on the financial statements. The opinion on the financial statements will point to the opinion on the internal control. They point to each other. Okay. And it is going to be contained. Did I say emphasis of matter, guys? I did, didn't I? Other matters. It's other matters because emphasis of matter is reporting on something that's disclosed in the financial statements, which the opinion on internal control would not be a disclosure in the financial statements. Other matters talk about things that we want to talk about that weren't necessarily discussed in the financial statement. So it's an other matters, a paragraph in the auditor's opinion on the financial statements when you use a combined report. You don't use a combined report, they have to point to each other. Now we're going to look at a pass key here in a minute that's going to talk about this inherent limitations section that you could include in this report. Okay, so just go over to the pass key. Okay, and just remind yourself that examiners have focused on the notion of including a inherent limitations paragraph. So internal controls have inherent limitations. Can you think of an inherent limitation in any system of internal control? The only reason I'm asking you is you might get a question on your CPA exam that's coming up that asks you about inherent limitation in internal control. So internal controls are perfect.
I guess collusion or something like that.
Yeah. Okay, good. Very good, Joseph. Yeah. Collusion could circumvent the internal controls, right? They're not designed to prevent collusion. Remember, we have all the separation of duties, but if two individuals get together to combine duties that are supposed to be separated, collusion, yeah, that's good. That's an inherent limitation. Human error is an inherent limitation. Okay, so the report, the opinion on internal control, we don't want people going, oh, look, the auditors are basically saying that these internal controls have angels flying around them. No, we're saying, hey, there's always some chance that stuff will happen and you should be aware of that. That's what that inherent limitations paragraph does. Good. Okay. All right, good. Now, what is the effect of identified weaknesses on the opinion? Okay, and so I'm not going to read you through the opinion. I've already asked you to flashcard the key elements, okay? But let's look at a couple things. Report date, okay? And it will coincide with the date of the auditor's report, because we have to, what? We have to issue it along with our report on the financial statement. So they're going to have the same date. Now take a look, guys. We will render an adverse opinion if we find a material weakness. Just how many? How many material weaknesses equal an adverse opinion?
Sounds like one.
One.
Just one. I love that. Doesn't complicate things at all for us. Gee, how many material, it's like that old commercial. How many licks does it get to the center? 1, 2, 3. No, one. That's it. You don't have to think about it. You find something, you've identified it as a material weakness, that equals an adverse opinion on the internal control. So what's missing here? If we were giving an unmodified opinion before we found one material weakness, and then we found one, and we went from an unmodified, unqualified opinion on internal control all the way down to adverse opinion, what step did we skip? What are the types of opinions you could give on financial?
Are you saying that we skipped the qualified?
Yeah, that was the mind reading I was asking you to do there, right? Yeah, we skip qualified. There is no qualified. We focus on material weaknesses equaling what? Adverse opinion. And you don't sit there and say, well, gee, what about qualified? Okay, so they're just trying to make it steel trap. One adverse opinion, one material weakness, adverse opinion. Okay, good. Now you come over and they start talking about other considerations, okay? Sorry, guys. It's nothing like sweating the small stuff, right? Like getting upset because my pen didn't change. Okay, so if management report fails to include one or more material weaknesses identified by the auditor should describe that weakness in your report. The auditor should also communicate that to management and those charged with governance. Okay, so again, you're writing this opinion, but they're also telling you, remember, management also should have written an assertion about the internal control as well. And if they miss something that you believe is a material weakness and they didn't call that out, then you'll call out the fact that they didn't call it out. If management's report includes a material weakness but does not fairly present that, you will call that out in your report. So not only are you calling out material weaknesses and issuing adverse opinions as a result, you're also calling out management for not doing a good job of describing those to the users of the financial statements. And then finally, the auditor should consider the effect of the adverse opinion on the financial statements and the amount of work that you did. So look, if you're issuing an adverse opinion on the internal control, and then you turn around and you looked at your, assessment of the risk material statement, and you were under the maximum and you didn't do the full measure of substantive testing, you might want to fix that, right? So they're just warning you, make sure you're consistent there, okay? Okay, good. Now we look at the internal control report for issuers, okay? And again, they said it could be separate or combined reports. If it is a separate report, and this is the annoying, they separated the discussion just because one is in an other matters paragraph, the other is in an explanatory paragraph, then you will call out the internal control finding in the combined report in a not other matters paragraph now, but explanatory paragraph. Other than that, the discussion is almost the same as it related to non-public companies for public companies here, okay? For example, here it comes again, we could call out the limitations on the internal control, potential for collusion, the potential for human error, right? Okay, going over, let's look at the report date. And the date of the report. You don't have to read through that whole paragraph, that whole report. The date of the report on internal control should coincide with the date of the report on the financial statement. So we said that before, so you can flashcard that. Okay, now you take a look, and what result will material weaknesses have? And a material weakness requires the auditor to issue what? Adverse opinion. How many?
Just one.
Just one. Good. No qualifications. No, you do not qualify. Okay, then what? Then it's either unqualified, unmodified, or what? Adverse, if you have one material weakness. Okay, and then some things we said before about the non-public companies. If management doesn't describe a material weakness, then you're going to have to describe it in your report, and you're required to let those charged with governance know that management's not really doing their job, are they? Because they need to include those in their assessment. Okay, if management report includes a material weakness but is not fairly presented, you're going to wrap them out in your report. Okay, and then again, the auditor should consider the effect of the adverse opinion, so you gave it, on the implications for the financial statement audit and your reliance on the internal control. So again, I mean, they separated non-public and public companies because one calls it other matters, the other calls it explanatory paragraph. Okay. Okay, good. Now let's go ahead and take a look at reporting on previously reported internal control weaknesses and what happens here. It could be that the entity realizes that they need some work on their internal controls. So they get busy and they start to try to make some corrections in previously noted problems, weaknesses, and then they ask you to give an opinion saying that they've corrected previously reported weaknesses. You're allowed to accept that engagement, and we're going to see that that engagement is going to be limited now to you commenting on weaknesses that have been previously reported, because they want the investing public to know that they have figured out how to fix these problems, right? And they want a third party to attest to that. So in some cases, management's assessment of the company's internal control may reveal that the company has one or more material weaknesses. If the material weaknesses are subsequently eliminated and management wants an independent auditor to attest to that, okay, then the auditor may perform such an engagement only if, and let's just take a look at some of the key elements here and flashcard that. They say only if the auditor has sufficient overall knowledge of both the company and its internal control. Management accepts responsibility for the effectiveness of internal control. The auditor's testing is limited to the control specifically identified as management having eliminated the weaknesses, and to issue an unmodified opinion, the auditor must obtain evidence about the design and operating effectiveness, meaning that you're going to have to test the controls that they supposedly have now fixed, and they can't limit your scope at all. Flashcard that. Okay. Okay, good. Then we come back together for the issuers and non-issuers now, and now we're going back to the report on the internal control, and we're going to talk about, well, what if the engagement to give the opinion on the internal control, the report opinion on internal control, what if there's been a scope limitation? And if there's been a scope limitation, you can either withdraw or disclaim. What's missing?
Qualify. Yeah.
Qualify.
There's no qualification. Good. There is no qualification on these internal control reports. You're either what? Unqualified, unmodified, or adverse. You're either what? Unqualified, unmodified, or disclaimer, or withdraw. Okay. Okay. So they can't limit your scope. Come over, even if you are disclaiming. Okay. Even if you're disclaiming. Huh? Where'd they put my stuff? Sorry guys, 1 second. Okay. Right here, okay, even if you are disclaiming any material weaknesses identified should be described. That's important. Flashcard that. That's what I was looking for. Even if you are disclaiming, you still have to call out the material weaknesses. So it's not like you're saying, well, I'm disclaiming, and even though I found all these material weaknesses, there's some scope limitation resulting in disclaimer. So haha, now I don't have to tell you those. No, you still need to include those in the report. Also, if the auditor cannot express an opinion due to scope limitation, management and those charged with governance. And I'm like, well, if who's restricting your scope if it's not management? But okay, you have to report that to management and those charged with governance. And then the auditor may issue a report disclaiming an opinion on internal control as soon as the auditor has precluded that there's a scope limitation. So you don't have to wait till you're releasing the report or whatever with the financial statements. You can just go ahead and issue that disclaimer immediately once you know you have a scope limitation that is sufficient to require you to disclaim. Okay. All right, good. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at this question. Sorry, guys, I'm having trouble finding the poll here. Okay, here we go. Oh, you know what? Stop for a second. I know you probably already have that question, but I'm going to end the poll. I'll let you come back to it. I'm going to take it down. Share results. There were no results. Let me move it out of the way. Because I forgot, I wanted to show you something, and I think it may be helpful with this question, so that's why I want to wait. So when you're on e-learning, okay, and you look at chapter 5, you'll see this PDF right here called Internal Control Communication. Why is that poll still there? Stop sharing results. I'm going to get rid of that poll. It's in the way. Okay, there. Okay, now you see this internal control communication. Okay, so you can go ahead and click on that. And I know it's a little bit hard to read, so you might have to put your face a little closer to the screen here. Okay, but let's just take a look. Okay, so notice I have a column here, engagement type. And we have non-public company under SAS, non-public company under SAS 130. That's the what? That's the optional opinion. And then PCAOB, that's the required, right? Okay, now what I did across the top is I put what I thought were some important elements from the text. So as you were going through the text, there were some things I was asking a flashcard, and then there were some that sounded like, well, why aren't we flashcarding that? And the reason was that it was on this flashcard I created for you. And so let's just take a look. Okay, so oral communication is never okay. When you have what? You have to give a written report, okay, but it's not required on all engagements. It's no. If you're just doing the straight financial statement under SAS, you only have to communicate the significant deficiency, SD, and material weaknesses that are identified. So you must report significant deficiencies, material weaknesses, who and when. You report those to management and those charged with governance. And remember, they gave us a 60-day window, right? The report, remember, we said is restricted. There is no need to have tested the operating effectiveness because you weren't there to give an opinion. The is no written management evaluation of internal control. Auditor evaluates management's response, that's NA. Because we're not giving any kind of opinion on the internal control, that's no. And so we don't have to worry about there being scope limitations or material weaknesses because we're not giving an opinion on the internal control. Okay, now you come over, and if you're doing this for a non-public company under SAS 130, there's no such thing as oral communication. We must have a written report on all engagements, and that written report will do what? It will call out, and it calls out everything: significant control deficiencies, material weaknesses, and significant deficiencies. We've got to report everything. Who to report it to? Management within 60 days, and those charged with governance have to know that such communication has been made. Significant deficiencies and material weaknesses need to go to management and those charged with governance. Okay, now that's just getting into the reporting requirements. The report is, our report on internal control is not restricted. It's a what? Opinion that's going to be included with management's assessment. So we have to test the operating effectiveness. Yes, management has a written assessment. The auditor evaluates that. We give an opinion, and what? We will have a scope limitation or material weakness. Scope limitation results in what? Disclaimer. The material weakness results in adverse, you never qualify. Okay. And then when you come over to the situation where we're talking about under PCAOB, we have to report what? We have to report all weaknesses. Okay. We report what? Control deficiencies to management and inform those charged with governance that such communication has been made. Significant deficiencies to management and those charged with governance, and there was no time specified. Material weaknesses have to go by the report release date. And then you come down, and the same things are said now about the report being restricted. You have to test operating effectiveness under both engagements. You get a written evaluation of management. Auditor evaluates that. And there's an opinion, yes. And if there's a scope limitation, you disclaim or adverse, never qualify. Okay, so I tried to pick up some of the key elements of what we talked about and put them on this one page. Okay, all right, so with that, hopefully that's somewhat helpful. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at that question we were working on. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and take a look at this one. And okay, most of us got it right, but not 75% of us. And I don't know, I guess this stuff's a little confusing. So that summary chart is going to be important. Okay, so remember, there's two different things going on here. There's communication to management of those charged with governance, and then there's the report on internal control. Those are two separate things. One is what are you reporting internally? The opinion, right, on the effectiveness of internal control is going external. Okay, so what must be communicated to management and the audit committee? Okay, that's the internal communication. And it's what? We have to report both significant deficiencies and material weaknesses. Those both had to be reported. That was right there on that summary chart that I gave you. Okay, but when it comes to what creates an adverse opinion, we said for an adverse opinion, it just takes what? One material weakness. Significant deficiencies did not stack or weight up into a adverse opinion. It was one material weakness. So the answer is what? You must report both significant deficiencies and material weaknesses, but only what? Only the material weakness, but not the significant deficiency results in the adverse opinion. So B was the answer. And it was important that what? That we talk about an issuer here, because for a non-issuer, you have to do what? You have to, well, no, I guess it's the same answer, isn't it? Same answer. It wouldn't make any difference. You have to report significant deficiencies and material weaknesses. Okay. All right. I'm looking at page 15 here. We may have to.
Page 15 is why I ended up going with D.
Because page 15, not sure why I'm having to go so far. Is it that far back? Page 15. Come on. The auditor must communicate in writing to management and the audit committee all material weaknesses. The next bullet down, the auditor should communicate to management in writing all deficiencies in internal control or financial reporting. Those deficiencies in internal control or financial reporting that are lesser magnitude than the material weakness, which would include significant deficiencies identified during the audit, and inform the audit committee that such communication has been made, right? So what page was that stupid question on? So I can find it this way.
Mine is 28, but I also have the 4.0 version.
Yeah, it's 28.
This is saying must be communicated to management and the audit committee. Well, significant deficiencies, yes, but for management, but not the audit committee, right? Material weaknesses, so that would make you think that, but if you look at what creates the adverse opinion, that's correct. It has to be B, right?
The adverse answer for B and D are the same.
And D says material weaknesses, but not significant deficiencies, but must be communicated to management and the audit committee. So you pick D?
Yeah, I ended up going with D just because based on page 15, the first sentence specified that it was only material weaknesses.
Yeah.
But in the bullets, it does mention significant deficiencies.
And if it said or, then I guess B could be correct, right? So yeah, I don't know. There's a problem with that question. Because I agree with you that D would be correct, because this says what? Unless I messed up and it's not D. Maybe I thought it was B and it's actually D is the right answer. Because now I'm looking at it and it seems like D is right. This wouldn't be it's embarrassing, but it wouldn't be the first time this has happened to me. So let's go and look at
It is B. I just checked it.
this software says it's B.
Yeah. For number 5391, I just looked it up in the Becker thing. It is B.
But I'm thinking D is right, isn't it? Material weaknesses, but not significant deficiencies, because the book says that significant deficiencies, the other deficiencies, and it says in parentheses there, right? Those not material weaknesses, so it'd be significant deficiencies and control deficiencies, need to go to management. They don't talk about those charged with governance. You just have to let those charged with governance know that such communication has been made, right? So I get to send an email to Becker tomorrow asking what the hell happened here. Right? Am I missing something, guys? I'm asking you.
In the bullet right below, it says the auditor is required to communicate any identified significant deficiencies in writing to the audit committee. You had a flashcard it.
What page?
815. So the first sentence
Don't
says,
don't get upset with me now. Maintain the level of respect here. Okay, hang on a minute. What you said, page 15. And you're saying on page 15.
yes, the first bullet point under that like sentence.
The first bullet point under that sentence, the auditor is required to communicate any identified significant deficiencies in writing to the audit committee. The auditor should communicate to management in writing all deficiencies, internal control that are a lesser magnitude than material weaknesses, and inform the audit committee.
I read that as only significant deficiencies need to be communicated to the audit committee, not material weaknesses.
No, that's not right. Because why would that be? Okay, number 2. So I'm right here now. I hate shit like this. Okay, so number 2 right here. The auditor must communicate in writing to management and audit committee all material weaknesses. Right? So that's saying all material weaknesses. Then the second bullet, the auditor is required to communicate any identified significant deficiencies to the audit committee. And then it says the auditor should communicate to management in writing all deficiencies in internal control or financial reporting. It says those deficiencies in internal control or financial reporting that are of lesser magnitude than material weaknesses. So don't these two bullets contradict each other? Hello?
I can't tell. My brain's spinning at this point.
I think something's not making complete sense. I would be curious to see what Becker says.
I mean, if it says the auditor is required to communicate identified significant deficiencies in writing to the audit committee, then why does it say management here? I mean, why wouldn't it just say communicate significant deficiencies and material weaknesses to management and those charged with governance? So I don't understand this. So I'll have to talk to them about this, because this doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to call out identify significant deficiencies to the audit committee, and then here the auditor should communicate to management in writing all deficiencies and material weaknesses. So, okay, it's horribly written, but so what I'm getting from this, though, and they should really, clean this up. And I apologize that I think I kind of misunderstood it because it was so poorly written, is that you're going to report all material weaknesses and significant deficiencies to management and those charged with governance. And then for the not good control deficiencies, report those to management and let those charged with governance know that such communication has been made. What screwed me up is they said that of a lesser magnitude than material weakness. They should have said less of magnitude than what? Than material weakness and significant deficiency, right?
I agree. I'm leaving myself notes for the flashcard.
Yeah, so I got kind of baited in, because when they put those deficiencies that are lesser magnitude than material weakness, in my mind, I X'd out significant deficiency without taking in the sentence before that said report significant deficiencies. They shouldn't have put that in parentheses there. So I will let them know that, unless I'm completely missing something else. Okay, but so yeah, so B is correct though, right? If you read it that way.
So when they said those lesser magnitude than material weaknesses, they were referring to significant deficiencies for that bullet point. Is that what they meant?
They mean, I don't know what they meant. I don't know what the hell they were talking about, because they contradict themselves. Okay, on page 15, they have somewhat of a contradiction here, in that in one, they're saying the auditor is required to communicate any identified significant deficiencies in writing to the audit committee, right?
Right.
And then it says the auditor should communicate to management in writing all deficiencies in internal control. Okay, so that means all three: not good control deficiency, significant deficiency, and material weakness, all got to go to management.
Yeah.
So the better way to have said this would have been up here: the auditor must communicate. So when they're right here, they should have said the auditor must communicate in writing to management and the audit committee all material weaknesses and significant deficiencies noted during the audit. I don't know why they didn't write it that way. Oh, I know what it is. I see. Okay. Because here they're saying, I see the problem. I see. I'm the problem. Okay, because here what they're saying is that all material weaknesses, and that the reporting has to be made prior to the issuance of the audit report. So for the material weaknesses, that has to go prior to the writing of the audit report, right? Then everything else, well, then significant deficiencies also got to go to management and those charged with the governance, but they don't give us a time.
Oh,
They're not calling out a time.
got it.
So, so material weaknesses go to management and those charged with governance prior to the issuance of the review report. Significant deficiencies go to management and those charged with governance, and they don't tell us a time. And then control deficiencies that they're not good go to management. They don't give us a time, but we have to report to those charged with governance that such communication has been made. That's what it is. Make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. And then they got what pisses me off is that the standards are so convoluted, and then they dare to ask us a question that contemplates that labyrinth of crap. But now that we figured it out, guys, and I apologize, I usually catch things like that a little more better when I'm reviewing, but now that we've seen all that, now we can look and which of the following best describes the responsibility of the auditor with respect to significant deficiencies and material weaknesses, both what must be communicated, right? It's just that for material weakness, they say prior to the report release date. For significant deficiencies, they don't call it a time. Okay? Question? And giving up on a question while we're trying to figure it out is not an option. I mean, you're here to continue to keep struggling through these. You don't get to just punt. Okay? All right. Okay. But my bad. I apologize. I didn't quite read that. As you can see, it wasn't exactly reading Mary Had a Little Lamb. So it gets a little bit funky, but let's go ahead and let's take a look now at the attestation engagement. Okay. And what happens? Well, remember we said that back in the day, auditors testified as to what their findings were about the financial statements, right? So auditors have been attesting, they've been testifying for a long time about whether or not financial statements are fairly presented, right? They said out loud, that's why they were called auditors. Well, people looked and said, well, if auditors can attest to financial statements, why can't they testify to things beyond just the historical financial statements? So the profession took a look at that. We said, okay, yeah, let's go ahead and set up a set of standards where the auditors are going to testify to something other than just the historical financial statements. So they decided, well, we're going to keep the auditing standards clean for audit of historical financial statements. But if an auditor attests to something other than the historical financial statements, then we'll put that under a set of standards called attestation standards. And that's what we're going to start talking about here. Okay, so attestation standards are a type of engagement gaining in importance. Attest engagements have grown out of the need to express an opinion on something other than basic historical financial statements. Okay, if we sit there and we're going to attest, give an opinion on historical financial statements, we just follow the auditing standards. Okay, now when we look at attest engagements, the different types of attest engagements that we'll get into, we're going to talk here about agreed upon procedures and financial forecasts. We're going to talk about MD&A here tonight. Okay, but these are things that are what? Beyond just the historical financial statements. Prospective financial statements are basically forward-looking. They're not historical. So when we give an engagement under these different areas, we follow the attestation standards. Okay. Now you take a look, and why don't you just go ahead and flashcard all these guys that would fall under the attestation standards. Okay, not historical financial statements. But when you take a look down here, there's going to be discussion later about the preparation and compilation of prospective financial statements. And that is going to be under the attestation standards. So when you're giving an attest to the prospective financial statements, then you follow, where'd that go? To the prospective financial statements, then you follow the attestation standards. But if you're going to compile or prepare, then you're under the SARS. Okay, so that gets a little bit confusing. We'll talk about SARS more in A6. Okay, so if you're going to attest to prospective financial statements, then you follow the attestation standards. If you're preparing or compiling, then you're going to go under the SARS. Okay. All right, good. Now we come over and we take a look at the next page. And when we're dealing with the statements on auditing standards now, then they do not apply, or I should say the attestation standards do not apply to audits, because we follow what? We follow the SASs. They do not apply to preparations, compilation, and review. Those fall under the SARS. So when an area has its own standards, it's obviously not under the attestation standards. Okay. Now, some points about attestation standards. We do not use the attestation standards for historical statements. That's the SARS. Okay. Now you come over and you can just flashcard this mnemonic. Flashcard this mnemonic right here. Okay. I'm not going to go through the bubbles and what each one of these mean. Just know that you have this care corp, and you're going to unfortunately have to sit there and write up, you know, what the C stands for, the A stands for, on the off chance that you get one question on the attestation standards, the, you know, high level attestation standards. We're going to be more into the specifics dealing with the prospective financial statements and the agreed upon procedures. Okay, but let's look at reporting requirements. Okay, and when you look at the reporting requirements, there's two ways that you can report. You can report on the assertion itself. Okay, now when you report on the assertion itself, you're looking at the management written assertion about whatever it is that they're telling you about the, say, MD&A or the prospective statements, whatever it is you're looking at. And the report could be on the assertion, or it could be on the subject matter itself. Okay, so flashcard that. So you may say, I am looking at the MD&A and I'm looking at management's assertion about the MD&A. Management says that the MD&A is fair and accurate. I am attesting to that, their assertion. Or you could say, I reviewed the MD&A and it appears to follow SEC guidelines, whatever. So you can report directly on the subject matter or on an assertion related to the subject matter. If you are looking at management's assertion related to that subject matter, then the assertion has to accompany the actual, your actual attestation on that, so they can see what assertion it is that you're actually attesting to. Now, in either case, even if you're going to report directly on the subject matter, you must get a written assertion from management. So management has to give the auditor the written assertion. So that written assertion is going to be in your pocket either way. If you're going to report directly on the subject matter, you don't present the assertion. If you're going to report on the assertion, then you'd have to report the assertion along with your report. If you are giving some sort of modified opinion on the assertion, some sort of modified report, I should say, then you are not going to be able to report on the assertion. You will have to report directly on the subject matter. Okay, so just some specifics on the reporting. You can go ahead and flashcard that. Coming over, if reporting on the assertion, it should accompany the practitioner's report, which we already said that. So we can flash, I said that while I was having you flashcard something else. Okay, I had you flashcard this, and I said, while I was asking you flashcard that, I said this, okay? And then concerns about scope restrictions. So let's take a look here. And if there's restriction on the scope and you are examining the subject matter, then we get the full menu of options. So we can qualify, we can disclaim, okay, we can withdraw. So they give us every option for scope limitation. If there is a scope limitation on a review, because we're sitting here and we're simply reviewing the material, there is no real drop down to a qualification or whatnot, because in a review, you're not giving any sort of positive assurance. Therefore, you can't qualify because you're not giving an opinion. You're giving a negative assurance in a review. And so you'd have no choice but to withdraw from the engagement. So if you're examining, you're giving a positive assurance, in my opinion, right? Examination is positive assurance. If you're giving positive assurance, which you're saying, in my opinion, and they limit your scope, then yeah, that can result in a qualified disclaimer. You may want to withdraw. With a review, you give negative assurance. With negative assurance, you basically say, I am not aware of problems. Well, look, if they limit your scope, where are you going to go? You're not giving an assurance. You're not saying, you're not giving a positive assurance. You're not saying, in my opinion. So how can you qualify an opinion that you haven't given? And so they say, well, if they limit your scope there, then you have no choice. You have to withdraw from the engagement. Okay, so flashcard that. And let's go ahead and let's take a look at this first question. Assuming I'm going to be able to find the mouse. I mean, I can't find my cursor. I got the mouse. I don't know where the cursor is. There it is. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and I want to move on from this one. So basically, we said that the attestation standards do what? You know, everyone who tried it got it right. We deal with what? We deal with things that are other than the historical financial statements. And so you start looking, and what A is dealing with what? Just generating through the use of computer software, but it's still what? Financial statements. So that would fall under the SASs. MD&A, yeah, that is not what? That is not the historical financial statements. Provided the client with financial statement does not include dollar amounts, I don't know that there's any kind of standard that falls under that. You're just suggesting to them, here's a format if you don't know what financial statements are supposed to look like. And what? Audit of financial statements. Well, if you're auditing the financial statements, I don't care if you're, auditing financial statements that were prepared for use in another country, you're still auditing. And we even talked about that back in one of the earlier chapters, I think chapter 1. Then you're not going to be under the attestation standards. You're going to be under the SASs, right? Okay, good. Now, when we talk about an examination, as I said above, examination is basically going to give a positive opinion, in my opinion, of financial statements. Okay, so when you take a look now at these reports, and you don't have to memorize them, okay, you don't really need to look at them. Just know that when you're giving an audit, you are giving examination, you're giving a positive assurance like an audit. With a review, you're giving a negative assurance, I am not aware. And we'll talk more about that in some of our other discussions, okay? All right, good, we'll get into the later chapters. Now, let's talk about agreed upon procedures, okay? And let's go ahead and take a look at the agreed upon procedure module here, okay? All right, so let's look at that. So what happens with agreed upon procedure? Well, let's say, I'm thinking, let's say that O'Brien is thinking of giving Joseph a loan. So Brian, you're the bank. Joseph, you're the company that wants the loan. And you guys are trying to figure out, well, what kind of financial information do we need to be able to sit here and decide to do this, right? To give the loan. So O'Brien, you're sitting there and you're saying, well, maybe audited financial statements would be good. When you start to look at that, you say, well, that might be more than we need here. Is there a drop down to that? Can we call in a CPA to advise us? Any CPAs in the room? Oh, okay. So I'll say, all right, look, I can audit the financial statements. And you say, well, I wanted to know what options there are. And so I sit there and say, well, I could just audit one line item, say accounts receivable. And you say, well, what will that involve? And I say, well, what I'll do is I'll confirm some accounts receivable that were outstanding at the end of the year. And I will also go ahead and what I'll do is when I do the confirmation, I'll ask for information about some specific transactions, some sales during the year. I'll do that in the confirmation. And for the collections on the accounts receivable, I'll look to see that if Joseph made a collection, that there was a deposit behind it. And guess what? I'll throw in the beginning balance of the accounts receivable for free. Ha. If I confirm the ending balance, I confirm the collections with the subtract, and I confirm some sales, which is the ads, that's going to tie out to the beginning balance, right? Okay. So you guys say, well, I don't know if that's, we need all that. And I say, well, you guys think about it and decide what you want. So you think about it and you say, well, we just want to look at the collection. John, we just want you to look at the collections. And I say, but wait a minute, you don't want confirmation? Shut up, John. Just do what we tell you to. Well, that's agreed upon procedures. Now, O'Brien and Joseph, they agree as to what they want me to do. They direct my efforts. Okay? Question? Okay, so what has to happen in order for me to accept an engagement like that? Okay, and I have to be independent, okay, because I'm still going to be doing some work that they're going to rely on. There has to be what? Agreement between the parties. So O'Brien and Joseph have to agree what it is they want me to do. There has to be something that is measurable. Can I measure how well O'Brien did in collecting on receivables during the year? Yeah, that's measurable. Hey, he says he collected, he showed some credits to his account receivable. And look, I see a deposit over here in the bank accounts for those, right? Okay. The sufficiency of the procedures is not the responsibility of the auditor. It is the responsibility of the related parties here now. So the two parties. So this is the responsibility, and they're not necessarily related parties. They're probably not related parties. It is the sufficiency of the procedures, the involved parties, O'Brien and Joseph here, okay? The use of the report is restricted, okay? So the use of the report is restricted to those two parties that have agreed. So that should be a U, guys. Use for use of the report is restricted. Okay, so we can't have a situation where, you know, Joseph drops a report and Raphael says, oh, I'm going to give O'Brien a loan too because look at this report. Raphael in that example would not have been privy to the conversation. So they agreed, and the sufficiency of the procedures only means something to those two. It's not like I, as a practitioner, came in and selected procedures that Raphael could rely upon. They directed me what to do. They agreed, and what it means something to them. Okay, so they are responsible for the subject matter. In this case, they being O'Brien and Joseph. And of course, we're going to go ahead and if we had prospective financial statements, which is looking like we're going to have to talk about those next time, there would be a summary of any significant assumptions. But you really need to flashcard these right here, these first ones. I am Sue, okay, as opposed to I am sure, because I think sometimes Becker keeps going just to make a mnemonic out of something. So really the key ones that you need to know are those first 5 there. Okay. Okay, good. Now you come over and let's take a look at what the agreed upon procedure report will have. Okay. And we start to come down and I'm going to ask you to flashcard just the ones I highlight. Okay. So a statement that the subject matter is the responsibility of the responsible parties. In this case, it's going to be O'Brien and Joseph. Okay. They are responsible. Stop, John. Right here. The sufficiency of the procedures, I highlighted the wrong thing. The sufficiency of the procedures is the parties, Brian and Joseph. A statement that we conducted the engagement following the AICPA and we're following the attestation standards now, right? A list of the procedures, fine, and related findings. So I'm going to say I selected 20 collections credits from O'Brien's account receivable. And for all 20, I was able to see that there was a deposit made for those. I selected 20, and for 15, I saw there was a deposit. For 5, I couldn't find a deposit. I looked at 10, I looked at 20, I found 10 for which there was a deposit. And I formed no opinion because I'm not selecting the procedure. The outcome of the procedure that those two agreed upon means something to them. They don't need me to give an opinion on that. They decided what they wanted me to do. Whatever it means to them. Now, I would tell, in that case, if you only could trace 10, I might say, well, you know, to the banks, well, that doesn't look like he really collected on those. But I don't have to say that because they told me to look for the collections. They should know what that means. It's agreement between them. So I don't have to form an opinion. And then I will be saying that I do not express an opinion or a conclusion. And then I'm going to restrict the report. Again, it is between those two. They directed my efforts. Nobody else supposedly knows what that discussion was all about and what it means. So they can only use that report for their purposes, whatever it is. Okay. Okay. I can't get through the other part here. Just note here though, before we go too much further. This is where I would enumerate the findings, okay? But I do not say, therefore, that means anything, because it means something to them. Okay? Okay, good. So we're not going to get to prospective statements tonight. We will pick that up on Wednesday. We will obviously finish chapter 2, and we will start making chapter 2, Jesus. And we will start making some more headway we'll finish chapter 5, and we'll start making some headway into chapter 6 next time. Okay? Question? Okay, guys. Huh?
Quick question. If I'm sitting for the exam on July 2nd, do you think that's enough time to go through the final review?
Well, we will finish everything on June 30th, right? Our last class is not June 30th, but June 28th. We have to have an offline discussion, okay? Because it's just going to start to get into a series of questions. So let's do that.
Okay.
So just hang on. When I say offline, just hang on. And guys, I will see you on, if there's no other questions, I will see you on
Oh,
Wednesday.
yes. Can you stay after for a moment, please?
Say that again.
Can you stay after? I have an unrelated question.
Well, I can't do 2 people at once. So if you want to give me, since she asked first, I'm going to do, was that Kristen?
Yes.
First, and then, so text me your number. You have a cell phone, right? Cornelius,
Yes.
were you the one that asked me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay, your voice got clear all of a sudden. Text me your number and I'll call you when I'm done with Christian, since she asked first.
All right.
Okay, anything else? Okay, guys, so I'm gonna go ahead and end the recording.